Welcome back to the Curious Case channel, where we warm hearts with stories as comforting as your morning coffee or tea. I'm your host today. We are steeping ourselves in the world of Miss Marple. Now tell me, don't you just love how stories bring us together? No matter where we are in this big, beautiful world before we begin. I'd love to know which corner of the world are you enjoying this story from. Let me know in the comments. I'm reading every single one. Let's get started. Chapter 1. The Withered Specimen. It was one of those perfect spring mornings in St. Mary Me when Miss Jane Marple found herself particularly grateful for the mild weather that allowed her to tend to her beloved roses. The air was sweet with their fragrance as she carefully pruned her deft fingers, moving with practiced precision, despite her advancing years. "Excuse me. Are you Miss Marple?" The voice, polite but firm, caused Miss Marple to look up from her rose bushes. Standing at her garden gate was a woman she had never seen before in the village. A composed figure in her 40s, wearing a sensible tweed suit that nonetheless suggested quality. There was an air of academic authority about her, from her sensible shoes to the intelligent gaze behind her tortoise-shell spectacles. "Yes, I am," Miss Marple replied, straightening up slowly and removing her gardening gloves. "And you are Dr. Eleanor Forsyth. I've recently been appointed curator of the Thornfield Botanical Gardens." The woman's handshake was brief but warm. "I wonder if I might have a word with you. I've been told you have quite remarkable knowledge of local plant species." Miss Marple's pale blue eyes twinkled with modest pleasure. "Oh dear. I'm afraid someone has been exaggerating. I simply have a lifelong interest, that's all. But do come in for some tea and you can tell me what brings you to St. Mary Me." Once settled in Miss Marple's sitting room with tea and seed cake, Dr. Forsyth came directly to the point. "Miss Marple, I find myself in a rather peculiar situation at Thornfield." She began, setting down her teacup with a slight frown. "I've discovered some discrepancies in our rare specimen collection. Several valuable plants appear to have been substituted with common varieties, and the substitutions have been cleverly disguised to avoid detection." "How very curious," murmured Miss Marple, her knitting needles clicking steadily as her mind began to work on this puzzle. "There's more, Doctor," continued my predecessor. "Professor Miles Harrington died suddenly 6 months ago. A heart attack while working late in the research greenhouse. It was ruled as natural causes." Of course, echoed Miss Marple, though there was a note in her voice that suggested nothing could be taken entirely for granted. Dr. Forsyth reached into her leather satchel and withdrew a small notebook. This was Professor Harrington's private research journal. "I found it while cataloguing his effects. There's something I'd like you to see." She opened the notebook to reveal a pressed plant specimen, withered but still recognizable to the trained eye. Beside it was written only a question mark and the cryptic notation, St. Mary Me." Miss Marple said immediately, "He's been here, hasn't he? That's what I wondered." Dr. Forsyth nodded. "Do you recognize this plant?" Miss Marple took the notebook and examined the specimen carefully, her faded blue eyes sharp with interest. "Yes, indeed, it's an unusual variant of Stellaria media, but with some quite distinctive characteristics. It grows in only one location near the village, by the old monastery ruins. Local folklore suggests it has medicinal properties. My grandmother used to make a tincture from it for rheumatism." "I thought as much, Doctor," said, her face lighting with professional enthusiasm. "It's a botanical anomaly. It shouldn't exist here at all, and certainly not with these adaptations. Professor Harrington must have been quite excited to find it." Their conversation was interrupted by a knock at the door. Miss Marple excused herself and returned moments later, accompanied by Colonel Bantry, an
old friend and neighbor.
"Forgive the intrusion," he said with an old-world courtesy. "I was passing and thought I'd drop off those jam jars. Mrs. Bantry promised you Jane." His eyes fell on Dr. Forsyth with interest. "Ah, I didn't realize you had company." After introductions were made, Dr. Forsyth mentioned Professor Harrington's name, prompting a response from the Colonel. "Harrington, the botanist fellow. Yes, he was here in the village last autumn. Quite interested in the old monastery ruins and the medieval herb garden. Their most enthusiastic chap. Asked all
Sorts of questions about the local history."
Dr. Forsyth and Miss Marple exchanged significant glances. After the colonel departed, they resumed their discussion with Dr. Forsyte, explaining more about the professor's research and her growing concerns about irregularities at the gardens. That afternoon, after Dr. Forsyte had left with a promise to return the following day, Miss Marple made her way to the monastery ruins on the outskirts of the village. The ancient stones stood in peaceful decay, with wild flowers and herbs growing in abundance among them. As she examined the area where the rare Stellaria variant grew, she became aware of a presence. A young man was photographing plants on the far side of the ruins when he noticed Miss Marple. He appeared, startled, almost guilty. He quickly packed his camera equipment. "Good afternoon," Miss Marple called pleasantly. "Are you interested in botany?" Yes, I am," he replied, coming closer, but maintaining a cautious distance. He was in his late 20s with an intensity about him that reminded Miss Marple of Professor Harrington based on Dr. Forsyte's description. "I'm Adam Harrington, visiting from London." Harrington. Miss Marple raised her eyebrows with well-feigned surprise. "Any relation to the late Professor Harrington of Thornfield Gardens?" "He was my uncle," Adam said, his expression guarded. "I worked as his assistant, and you are Miss Marple, a resident of St. Mary Me."
"All my life."
"I'm afraid nothing very exciting." She smiled disarmingly. "Were you close to your uncle?" "Very. His death was unexpected," something in his tone suggested. "More than
Simple grief." Before Miss Marple could probe further,
he glanced at his watch. "I must be going. It was nice to meet you, Miss Marple." She watched him
stride away, thoughtful lines
creasing her forehead that evening. As Miss Marple sat by her fire, completing a letter to her nephew Raymond, the telephone rang. The voice on the other end was Dr. Forsyte's, agitated and breathless. "Miss Marple, I'm at the research greenhouse. I found something in the professor's notes. Something alarming, I think. I know what happened today." There was a sudden crash followed by silence. "Dr. Forsyte," Miss Marple called. But there was no response, only the soft hum of an open line. The next morning brought news that Dr. Elenina Forsyte had been found unconscious in the research greenhouse at Thornfield Gardens. An overturned pot of soil lay beside her, and most curiously of all, clutched in her hand was a rare plant specimen, one believed to have been extinct for centuries. Miss Marple, hearing this news from the village constable, put away her gardening gloves and reached for her hat and coat. It was clear that the botanical mystery required her immediate attention. Chapter 2: Seeds of Deception. The hospital corridor was quiet, save for the soft squeak of rubber-soled shoes as nurses moved efficiently from room to room. Miss Marple sat patiently outside Dr. Forsyte's room, her knitting needles moving with rhythmic precision as she waited for the doctor to finish his examination. "You may see her now, but only briefly," the young doctor said as he emerged. "She's suffering from a concussion and appears to have no memory of the incident." Miss Marple nodded, tucking away her knitting inside the room. Dr. Forsyte lay pale against the white hospital linens, a bandage around her head. Her eyes brightened slightly at the sight of her visitor. "Miss Marple, how good of you to come. I'm afraid I've made rather a fool of myself." "Nonsense," Miss Marple said kindly. "Can you remember anything at all about what happened?" Dr. Forsyte frowned, wincing at the movement. "I was examining some of Professor Harrington's notes in the research greenhouse. I found something important, but it's all a blank after that." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Inspector Slack, whose perpetual air of harassed efficiency was immediately recognizable to Miss Marple. He had been involved in several investigations in St. Mary Me before, and while he had little patience for what he considered an interfering old lady, experience had reluctantly taught him to value her insights. "Ah, Miss Marple, I might have known you'd be involved," he said, his tone suggesting this was not entirely welcome. "Just a routine inquiry, Dr. Forsyte. At first we assumed you'd simply fallen, but the analysis of the soil that spilled near you has revealed traces of a powerful sedative, not the sort of thing one typically finds in plant soil." Dr. Before's eyes widened. "You mean someone deliberately?" "It appears so," Inspector Slack confirmed, his notebook at the ready. "Now, can you think of anyone who might wish to harm you?" While the questioning continued, Miss Marple's mind was already working on a plan after leaving the hospital. She made her way to Thornfield Botanical Gardens, presenting herself at the administration office with a carefully crafted explanation. "I thought perhaps I might be of some assistance during Dr. Forsyte's absence," she explained to the elderly secretary, who introduced herself as Mrs. Pritchard. "She had consulted me just yesterday about some local plant specimens. You see, I've been an amateur botanist all my life, and while I wouldn't presume to have any professional knowledge, I might be able to help maintain continuity with her current projects." Mrs. Pritchard, who had served as secretary at the gardens for decades, seemed grateful for the offer and promptly introduced Miss Marple to the small
staff, Geoffrey Blake.
The assistant curator was a tall man with thin-rimmed glasses and ambitious eyes. His specialty, Miss Marple learned, was toxic plants, a fact she filed away carefully. "Dr. Forsyte has been making unnecessary changes to systems that worked perfectly well under Professor Harrington," he commented with just a hint of resentment. Lucia Moretti, an Italian botanist on a research exchange program, had a warm manner and expressive hands that moved as she spoke. "The professor, he was a genius," she said earnestly. "His work on plant hybridization was revolutionary." Thomas Jenkins, the head gardener, was a weather-beaten man whose family, Mrs. Pritchard informed her, had tended the ground. She offered only a gruff nod before returning to his work. As Mrs. Pritchard showed Miss Marple around, she observed the interactions among the staff. There was a palpable tension, particularly between Geoffrey Blake and Adam Harrington, whom she encountered again in the main greenhouse. "What are you doing here?" Adam asked Miss Marple, his surprise evident before she could answer. Blake interjected coldly, "Miss Marple is assisting while Dr. Forsyte recovers. Some of us, Adam, prefer to support the garden's current leadership rather than living in the past." Adam's face flushed. "My uncle's work deserves to be continued properly, not sidelined for your commercial projects." The research greenhouse, when Miss Marple finally had a chance to examine it, yielded several curiosities. Locked cabinet bearing Professor Harrington's name remained sealed pending inventory. According to Mrs. Pritchard, a logbook on the central workbench had several pages carefully removed, the cut edges still visible along the binding. Most intriguing were the collection of soil samples labeled not with plant names, but with coordinates. Those were part of the professor's special project, Mrs. Pritchard explained when she noticed Miss Marple's interest. "He became quite secretive about it in his final months, called it the discovery of a lifetime. Poor man, he never got to publish his findings later." As Miss Marple enjoyed a cup of tea in Mrs. Pritchard's office, the secretary spoke with the familiarity of long service. Professor Harrington was a brilliant man, but difficult, demanding. Not everyone appreciated his methods. "I imagine Dr. Forsyte has faced challenges stepping into such a role," Miss Marple suggested. "Indeed." Mrs. Pritchard lowered her voice. "Between ourselves, there were those who felt the position should have gone to someone already familiar with the garden's work. Adam Harrington expected to inherit his uncle's position, and Geoffrey Blake has seniority. Dr. Forsyte was an outsider before leaving the gardens." Miss Marple made a detour to the village post office, where the postmistress, Miss Blankenop, was always a reliable source of information. "Professor Harrington?" the postmistress responded to Miss Marple's casual inquiry. "Oh yes, he received several packages from South America in the months before he died. Very excited about them. He was asked me personally to handle them with special care." The following morning, Miss Marple returned to the monastery ruins, this time with a more specific purpose. The area where the unusual Stellaria variant grew was near what would have been the infirmary in medieval times, a significant location for plants with medicinal properties. As she examined the ground, she noticed something that had escaped her attention. The previous day, a patch of recently disturbed earth, as if someone had been digging nearby, partially concealed by a fallen stone, was a crumpled page torn from a botanical notebook. Miss Marple carefully retrieved it, smoothing out the paper to reveal a detailed sketch of a plant she didn't recognize. Labeled in a neat hand, monk's foot stellata, extinct since 1559. Below the sketch was a note: medicinal properties consistent with Brother Ambrose's manuscript. Possible cure for all ills. The handwriting matched that in Professor Harrington's notebook that Dr. Forsyte had shown her. Miss Marple stared at the drawing with growing excitement. If this plant believed extinct since the dissolution of the monasteries under Henry VIII had somehow survived here in St. Mary Me, it would indeed be the discovery of a lifetime. And she reflected as she carefully folded the paper and placed it in her handbag. Perhaps also a motive for murder that evening. As she organized her thoughts over a cup of cocoa, Miss Marple created a neat list of questions. Why had Professor Harrington been so secretive about his discovery? What connection existed between the monastery ruins and the soil samples in the research greenhouse? Who stood to benefit from suppressing his findings? And most urgently, who had attacked Dr. Forsyte, and what had she discovered in the professor's notes that had put her in danger? The telephone's sharp ring interrupted her contemplation. It was Dr. Forsyte, her voice stronger but tinged with determination. Miss Marple, I'm being released tomorrow. And I'm going back to the garden immediately. Whatever happened to me was no accident. And I believe it's connected to Professor Harrington's death. There's something in that greenhouse that someone doesn't want me to find. Please be careful, Miss Marple, cautioned Inspector Slack. Believes Inspector Slack dismissed the professor's death as natural causes. Dr. Forsyte interrupted. I'm not inclined to trust his judgment. Will you meet me at the gardens tomorrow? There's something I need to show you. After promising to do so, Miss Marple replaced the receiver thoughtfully. The seeds of deception had been planted long ago at Thornfield Gardens. She suspected now they were beginning to bear deadly fruit. Chapter 3. The Greenhouse Incident. The morning sun cast dappled shadows through the glass panels of the main greenhouse as Miss Marple made her way toward the research section of Thornfield Gardens. She had deliberately arrived early, hoping to have a quiet moment to observe before meeting Dr. Forsyte. The gardens were peaceful at this hour, with only the occasional gardener visible among the meticulously maintained beds. You're an early bird, Miss Marple, came a voice from behind a spectacular display of orchids. Thomas Jenkins emerged, pruning shears in hand today. He wore heavy gardening gloves, which he always did. Mrs. Pritchard had mentioned, due to an almost religious devotion to protecting his hands from the various toxic plants in the collection. I find one notices more when a place is just waking up, Miss Marple replied with a smile. You must know every plant here intimately, Mr. Jenkins. 5 generations of my family have tended these grounds, the head gardener said with quiet pride. My grandfather worked here when it was still the private collection of Lord Thornfield before it was open to the public. Then you would have known Professor Harrington. Well, a shadow crossed Jenkins' weathered face. I did. A brilliant man, but he changed in those last months, secretive, working at odd hours. It wasn't like him before. Miss Marple could probe further. She saw Dr. Forsyte approaching. Despite her recent injury, the curator moved with determination, though her pal suggested she had left the hospital against medical advice. Miss Marple, thank you for coming, Dr. Forsyte said, her voice low. I need to show you something in my office first. Once they were seated in the curator's office with the door firmly closed, Dr. Forsyte withdrew a file from her desk drawer. I found discrepancies in Professor Harrington's research funding, she explained, opening the file to reveal a series of financial records. Large sums allocated for specialized equipment that, as far as I can determine, was never delivered. Miss Marple examined the documents carefully. These payments went to Meridian Pharmaceuticals. Yes, but there's no record of what was purchased. And when I inquired about the transaction, their accounts department had no knowledge of it. Dr. Forsyte leaned forward, wincing slightly at the movement now about that specimen they found in my hand after the attack. It's a plant called monkshood stellata, believed extinct for centuries, like the one in the drawing I found at the monastery ruins. Miss Marple murmured. Exactly, the medieval texts describe it as having remarkable healing properties. Modern analysis suggests it contains compounds that might be effective against certain types of cancer, a discovery potentially worth millions to pharmaceutical companies. Their conversation was interrupted by a knock at the door. Geoffrey Blake entered without waiting for a response, his manner coldly professional. Dr. Forsyte, I wasn't informed you would be returning today. I've been managing the neotropical specimen cataloging in your absence. His gaze flickered to Miss Marple with barely concealed impatience. "Thank you, Geoffrey. I'll review your work later today." Dr. Forsyte replied with equal formality. "Miss Marple is assisting me with some research into local specimens." After Blake departed, Dr. Forsyte sighed. "He's brilliant but difficult." He and Professor Harrington had several disagreements over research priorities. Blake believes we should focus exclusively on commercially viable specimens. Later that morning, Miss Marple observed Inspector Slack interviewing Geoffrey Blake in the Pavilion Cafe. Though she couldn't hear their conversation, the assistant curator's defensive posture told its own story. When the inspector departed, Miss Marple approached him with the air of someone making a casual inquiry. "Any progress?" Inspector Slack gave her a look of resigned tolerance. "Mr. Blake admits to disagreements with the professor, but denies any wrongdoing. He suggests that Adam Harrington might have motives for sabotage, having been passed over for the curator position." "I see," Miss Marple said thoughtfully. "Have you examined the visitor logs for the gardens? Sometimes the most obvious clues are overlooked, though." Slack bristled at the implied criticism. He took her suggestion, allowing Miss Marple to accompany him to the administration office. The logs revealed something interesting. A representative from Meridian Pharmaceuticals had met with Professor Harrington several times in the months before his death, but these meetings did not appear in his official calendar. This discovery prompted Miss Marple to make a visit to Meridian's regional office the following day, presenting herself as a member of the Village Flower Show Committee seeking corporate sponsorship. The receptionist directed her to the Public Relations Department, where a young woman named Miss Davies was happy to discuss potential community partnerships. "Meridian has always supported botanical research," Miss Davies said brightly. "In fact, we had been funding some of Professor Harrington's work at Thornfield Gardens. Such a tragedy, his passing." "Oh, you knew him?" Miss Marple asked innocently. "Not personally, but our research director Dr. Parrish worked closely with him on a project related to rediscovered medieval medicinal plants. It was all very exciting. The potential for new treatment pathways based on ancient knowledge." The conversation yielded valuable information, but as Miss Marple prepared to leave, she noticed a framed photograph on the wall, showing the Meridian board of directors. Among them was a face she recognized: Geoffrey Blake, standing slightly behind the others, as if not a part of the group that evening. As shadows lengthened across the gardens, Miss Marple received an urgent telephone call from Thomas Jenkins. "Miss Marple, I need to speak with you," the gardener said, his voice uncharacteristically agitated about the professor's work. "There's something you should know. I've been observing some strange activities in the greenhouse at night." "What sort of activities, Mr. Jenkins?" "Not over the telephone. Can you meet me at the East Greenhouse tomorrow morning before anyone else arrives?" 7 o'clock. After agreeing, Miss Marple had a restless night, her mind turning over the various pieces of the puzzle. By dawn she was dressed, and making her way through the morning mist toward Thornfield Gardens. The gates would not officially open until 9, but Thomas Jenkins had mentioned a service entrance that the gardeners used when she reached the East Greenhouse. However, there was no sign of Jenkins. Miss Marple waited patiently, watching as the sun rose higher, and garden staff began to arrive. Just as she was considering whether to inquire at the main office, she heard a cry from inside the greenhouse. Dr. Forsyte stood frozen in the doorway, her hand pressed to her mouth, following her gaze. Miss Marple saw what had caused her distress. Thomas Jenkins lay sprawled on the floor among scattered pots and soil, his face contorted in a grimace of pain. Beside him was a rare plant with distinctive purple flowers, its broken stem leaking sap. By the time Inspector Slack and the police doctor arrived, there was no doubt that Jenkins was dead. The preliminary assessment suggested accidental contact with a toxic plant, a risk well known to those who worked with such specimens. Yet Miss Marple, examining the scene with careful eyes, noticed something odd. The gardener's heavy gloves, which he had been wearing just the day before, and was known to never work without, were conspicuously absent. "This was no accident," she murmured to Dr. Forsyte, as police technicians photographed the scene. "Mr. Jenkins was expecting someone this morning, someone he trusted enough to remove his gloves." Dr. Forsyth nodded slightly, her professional composure masking her distress. The plant beside him is Atropa fatalis, extremely toxic but not native to this greenhouse. It belongs in the restricted collection behind 2 locked doors. As the body was removed and Inspector Slack began questioning staff members, Miss Marple quietly examined the area near where Jenkins had fallen. Among the scattered soil and broken pottery she found a torn scrap of paper bearing what appeared to be part of a molecular diagram. Before she could examine it further, Geoffrey Blake approached a terrible tragedy. He said, his expression appropriately somber. Jenkins was an excellent gardener, but perhaps too confident around dangerous plants. This is why we have strict protocols. Indeed, Miss Marple replied mildly, though I understand Mr. Jenkins was particularly careful about wearing his gloves. Blake's eyes narrowed slightly. Everyone makes mistakes, Miss Marple, even experienced gardeners. Later that afternoon, as police activity at the gardens wound down, Miss Marple sought out Adam Harrington, finding him in the herrarium, examining pressed specimens. Mr. Harrington, I understand you worked closely with your uncle. Did he ever mention Meridian Pharmaceuticals to you? Adam looked up sharply. How do you know about that? It's in the visitor logs. Their representative met with him several times. I told him not to trust them, Adam said bitterly. Wanted to commercialize his discovery patent. It control access, but my uncle believed medical advances should benefit everyone, not just those who could afford expensive treatments. The monk's hood stellata, Miss Marple said quietly. Adam's eyes widened. You know about that? Yes, the plant my uncle rediscovered at the monastery ruins. The plant that might have gotten him killed. You believe his death wasn't natural? I know it wasn't. My uncle had a heart condition. Yes, but it was well managed the night he died. He called me excited about a breakthrough. He said he finally had proof of something that would change botanical history. The next morning he was dead. Adam's voice cracked slightly. And now Jenkins, he was helping me investigate. He knew the gardens better than anyone. As Miss Marple left the herbarium, she reflected that the greenhouse incident had indeed revealed much. Not just about Jenkins' death, but about the tangled web of secrets surrounding Professor Harrington's research. Someone at Thornfield Gardens was willing to kill, to protect those secrets. And as she made her way back to St. Mary Me in the gathering dusk, Miss Marple had the distinct feeling that she was now in Tasia Self. Chapter 4. Roots of Suspicion. News of Thomas Jenkins' death spread through St. Mary Me with the swift efficiency that only small villages seem to manage by morning. Everyone knew that the head gardener at
Thornfield had died under mysterious circumstances.
The vicar's wife calling on Miss Marple, with the ostensible purpose of discussing the church flower rota, brought a wealth of gossip. They say it was that dreadful plant poison, she confided, accepting a cup of tea like something
From a medieval murder.
And you were there, Jane. How simply awful for you. Yes, very distressing, Miss Marple agreed mildly, though her thoughts were already turning to the investigation, rather than the shock of discovery. Poor Mr. Jenkins was a most knowledgeable gardener. After her visitor departed, Miss Marple telephoned Thornfield Gardens, and was not surprised to learn that Inspector Slack had established a police presence on the grounds. When she arrived later that morning, there was a constable stationed at each entrance checking identification. Miss Marple, Dr. Forsyth, greeted her with visible relief, ushering her into the curator's office. I'm glad you've come. The situation has become quite tense. Inspector Slack is convinced now that both Jenkins' death and the attack on me were deliberate. Has anything else been discovered? Miss Marple inquired, settling herself into a chair. Dr. Forsyth lowered her voice. Despite the closed door, the soil samples, several have disappeared from the research greenhouse, and after you left yesterday, I found something. She reached into her desk drawer and withdrew a small brass key. This was concealed in a potted specimen in Professor Harrington's private collection, a plant that had been incorrectly labeled as common ivy. And what does it open? Miss Marple asked, examining the key with interest. Come with me. They made their way to the research greenhouse, now guarded by a rather bored-looking young constable who nodded them through. Dr. Forsyte led Miss Marple past the main work area to what appeared to be a storage section behind a tall shelving unit, filled with empty pots and soil bags. She revealed a concealed door almost invisible when the shelves were fully stocked. Professor Harrington's secret growing area, she explained, inserting the key into a well-disguised lock. I found references to it in his notes, but couldn't locate it until yesterday. The door swung open to reveal a small chamber, illuminated by specialized growing lights. But instead of the expected plants, they found empty growing trays and a few scattered implements. The area had been cleared out with only trace evidence of soil and plant material remaining. Someone has removed everything, Dr. Forsyte said, disappointment evident in her voice. But look here. She pointed to a small notebook that had fallen behind one of the growing tables.
Inside were detailed measurements
And observations all coded with the same coordinate system
Miss Marple had observed on the soil samples.
I believe he was cultivating the monk's hood stellata. Here Dr. Forsyte said, experimenting with growing conditions
Or to match those at the monastery ruins.
But why such secrecy? Miss Marple wondered aloud. Surely a botanical discovery of this magnitude would be celebrated unless there was more to it than simple rediscovery. Dr. Forsyte replied thoughtfully, something about this plant made it worth killing for that afternoon. Miss Marple decided to call on Mrs. Jenkins, the gardener's widow. She found the woman in a neat cottage at the edge of the village, surrounded by family and neighbors bringing condolences and practical help. It's very kind of you to visit, Miss Marple, Mrs. Jenkins said when they were finally able to speak privately in the small back garden. Thomas always spoke highly of you, even in the short time you were at the gardens. He was a very knowledgeable man. Miss Marple said gently. Mrs. Jenkins, did your husband mention anything to you about concerns he had at work, anything unusual he might have noticed? The widow hesitated, twisting her handkerchief. He was troubled these past few weeks, said there was something not right happening at the monastery ruins. Someone digging at night. Thomas went there himself after dark. He said he needed to see what they were after. Did he find anything? He took a soil sample. Mrs. Jenkins said, her voice dropping to a whisper, said it might explain why Professor Harrington had been so interested in the place. He kept it in his tool shed. The small wooden shed at the bottom of the garden was meticulously organized, with each tool hanging in its proper place. The domain of a man who took pride in his work. In a locked drawer which Mrs. Jenkins opened with a key kept on the window sill, they found a small glass jar containing soil. He meant to have it analyzed, Mrs. Jenkins explained, said there was something strange about it. Not like the native soil around here. Miss Marple accepted the jar carefully. Would you allow me to have this examined? It might help understand what happened to your husband back at Thornfield Gardens. Miss Marple was surprised to find Lucia Moretti waiting outside the main entrance, apparently watching for her arrival. Miss Marple, the Italian botanist said urgently, drawing her aside to a secluded bench beneath a large magnolia. I need to speak with you privately. Once they were seated, Lucia continued in a low voice. I have been afraid to say this to the police, but after what happened to Thomas, she glanced around nervously. I was collaborating with Professor Harrington on a special project. We were analyzing plant specimens from South America that shared characteristics with medieval European medicinal plants. The packages from South America that the postmistress mentioned, Miss Marple said with a nod. Yes, the professor had a theory that certain plant knowledge had been exchanged between continents long before Columbus, that monks or early explorers had brought back specimens or perhaps taken European plants to the New World. What a fascinating theory, Miss Marple commented, her mind working quickly. But surely not one that would provoke murder. Lucia leaned closer. Geoffrey Blake strongly opposed this research, called it wasting resources on folk remedies. He wants Thornfield to focus on partnerships with pharmaceutical companies developing commercially viable products like Meridian Pharmaceuticals. Miss Marple murmured, exactly. Blake has connections there, but there's more. Lucia's voice dropped even lower. The night before the professor died, he told me he had proof not just of the plant's existence but of its extraordinary properties. He said it was evolution in action. a plant that had adapted and survived in isolation for centuries, developing unique compounds before Miss Marple could inquire further. They were interrupted by the arrival of Inspector Slack, who informed them that the police had completed their initial examination of the research greenhouse and were now focusing on Professor Harrington's death, which had been reopened as a possible homicide. Later that day, Miss Marple learned that Professor Harrington's personal effects had been released by the police to Adam Harrington. She found him in his uncle's former office, sorting through boxes of paper and photographs. "My uncle's life's work," Adam said with a mixture of pride and sadness. "Most of it will go to the garden's archives. But there are personal items my family will want." Among the photographs was one that caught Miss Marple's attention: Professor Harrington in what appeared to be a South American jungle, standing beside an elderly indigenous man wearing elaborate traditional dress. His last expedition, Adam explained, to the Amazon basin. He was researching traditional plant medicines used by remote tribes. Miss Marple examined the photograph more closely, noticing something in the background. Barely visible behind the two men was a plant with distinctive, star-shaped flowers that bore a striking resemblance to the drawing of monk's hood stellata she had found at the monastery ruins. "Mr. Harrington, may I borrow this photograph? I believe it might be important," Adam agreed. And Miss Marple continued her examination of the professors. A patience was rewarded when she discovered a desk calendar with a false bottom. Within the hidden compartment was a small envelope containing seeds labeled MS Hybrid and a slip of paper with coordinates that matched those on the soil samples in the research greenhouse when plotted on a map, as Miss Marple did that evening in her cottage. These coordinates corresponded exactly to the monastery ruin in St. Mary Me. Of course, she murmured to herself. It wasn't just that he found the plant growing wild. He was cultivating it deliberately, using the original location. The ringing of the telephone interrupted her thoughts. It was Dr. Forsyth. "Miss Marple, I've had that soil sample analyzed. The results are extraordinary. It contains mineral compounds not native to England. In fact, they closely match soil samples from the Andean region of South America, as if someone had deliberately created the growing conditions." Miss Marple suggested precisely. "But there's more. I've been going through Professor Harrington's correspondence. He had been in contact with a monastic archive in Spain, researching records from the early 16th century. There's a reference to a brother Ambrose bringing back plants from a New World expedition and cultivating them in secret at St. Mary Me Monastery." Miss Marple's eyes widened as the pieces began to fall into place. "Dr. Forsyth, I believe we need to examine the monastery ruins again, but this time with a very specific purpose. Can you meet me there tomorrow morning at dawn? And please tell no one where you're going." After hanging up, Miss Marple sat for a long time contemplating the roots of suspicion that now extended back centuries. What had begun as a simple botanical mystery had revealed something far more profound, a secret passed down through generations, preserved in the soil of St. Mary Me, and someone was willing to kill to control that secret. Before retiring to bed, Miss Marple wrapped the soil sample from Thomas Jenkins's shed carefully and placed it in her handbag along with the seeds from Professor Harrington's desk. Tomorrow, she thought, they would discover exactly what made Monk's Hood Stella worth dying for, and perhaps also worth killing for. Chapter 5. The curator's collection. Dawn painted the sky in delicate shades of pink and gold as Miss Marple made her way along the dewy path to the monastery ruins. She had risen early, packing a small bag with the soil sample from Thomas Jenkins's shed, the seeds from Professor Harrington's desk, and a few essential tools she thought might be useful: a small tell specimen bags and a magnifying glass that had been a gift from her nephew Raymond. The ruins were peaceful at this hour, with only birdsong disturbing the stillness. Miss Marple waited patiently by the crumbling archway that had once been the entrance to the monastery church when Dr. Forsyth appeared a few minutes later. She carried a similar collection of botanical implements along with a folder of papers. "I've been up half the night studying Professor Harrington's notes," the curator said by way of greeting, her eyes bright with excitement despite the early hour. "The references to Brother Ambrose are fascinating. He accompanied an early expedition to the Americas in the early 1500s, decades before most organized exploration. When he returned to England, He brought plant specimens that he cultivated in secret. And you believe the monk's hood stellata was among them? Miss Marple asked as they began to walk toward the area where she had found the torn notebook page. I'm almost certain of it. The monks here were known for their healing arts. The monastery infirmary was famous throughout the region. Brother Ambrose's journals, fragments of which were preserved in the Spanish archive, speak of a heaven-sent remedy that could cure ailments that had previously been fatal. They reached the sheltered corner of the ruins where the infirmary had once stood. Here the ancient walls provided protection from harsh winds, creating a microclimate that might have allowed delicate plants to survive. This is where I found the pressed specimen, Miss Marple said, indicating the spot. Dr. Forsyte nodded, and began to examine the area methodically, moving from stone to stone with professional precision. Miss Marple followed a different approach, considering where a medieval monk might have chosen to cultivate precious plants. Somewhere sheltered but with good access to morning sunlight near a water source, yet hidden from casual observation. Dr. Forsyte, she called softly after a few minutes, I believe we should look here. She had identified a section where the ruins formed a natural enclosure partly shielded by a wild tangle of native vegetation that had grown up against the stones over centuries. It was not immediately visible from any of the paths visitors typically followed. Working together, they carefully parted the dense growth ivy and brambles behind this natural screen. In a sheltered patch of ground where the morning sun now fell in dappled patterns, they discovered something remarkable. A small cluster of plants unlike any Miss Marple had seen in her extensive knowledge of English flora. Extraordinary, Dr. Forsyte breathed, kneeling to examine them more closely. These appear to be natural hybrids of monk's hood stellata. The basic structure is consistent with medieval descriptions, but they show clear signs of adaptation, probably over centuries of isolation. They've evolved, Miss Marple said with wonder, just as Professor Harrington suspected. Dr. Forsyte nodded, her professional composure barely containing her excitement. This is botanically unprecedented. These plants have survived for centuries in this microclimate, adapting and evolving in isolation. The implications for our understanding of plant adaptation are revolutionary, not to mention the potential medicinal properties. They began carefully collecting specimens with Dr. Forsyte, explaining the proper techniques to preserve both the plants and their habitat. Miss Marple watched the curator's methodical approach with approval, noting how she took only what was needed for study, ensuring the colony would remain viable. The remarkable thing, Dr. Forsyte said as she labeled a specimen bag, is that these plants shouldn't be here at all. South American species couldn't normally survive in the English climate, especially not for centuries. But this sheltered location, combined with the unusual soil composition, it's as if someone deliberately created the perfect conditions. Brother Ambrose, Miss Marple murmured, and after him perhaps generations of caretakers, who maintained the tradition. Mr. Jenkins mentioned that his family had been gardeners for generations. As Dr. Forsyte collected a soil sample for comparison, Miss Marple pondered the implications. Professor Harrington must have discovered these plants and recognized their significance immediately. But why keep it secret? Because of their value, came a cold voice from behind them. Geoffrey Blake stood at the entrance to their secluded corner, his face tight with suppressed excitement. In his hand was a small vial of clear liquid. I've been following your progress with great interest, ladies. How convenient that you've done all the detective work for me. Mr. Blake, Miss Marple said calmly, though her heart had begun to beat faster. I take it you're interested in these plants as well. Interested? Blake gave a short laugh. Do you have any idea what they're worth? Pharmaceutical companies would pay millions for exclusive rights to compounds found nowhere else on Earth. Harrington was a fool. He wanted to publish his findings, make them available to everyone, all that potential profit lost to idealism. So you killed him, Dr. Forsyte said, her voice steady, despite the accusation. Blake smiled thinly. I prefer to think of it as protecting an investment. Harrington had a known heart condition. No one questioned a heart attack. It would have been perfect if he hadn't left those damned notes and specimens for you to find. Held up the vial. This contains a toxin extracted from rare plants in our collection. It leaves no trace. The same compound I used on that interfering gardener when he caught me removing plants from these ruins. And now you plan to silence us as well," Miss Marple said, her mild tone belying the gravity of the situation. "I'm afraid so. A tragic accident. Two amateur botanists misidentifying a toxic species. It happens even to professionals sometimes." Before Blake could move closer, however, there was a commotion from the path. Adam Harrington burst into the clearing, followed closely by Lucia Moretti. Both stopped short at the tableau before them. "Blake," Adam said tensely, "we've been following you since you left the gardens. Put that vial down." "Don't be ridiculous," Blake sneered. "You're hardly in a position to give orders. Your precious uncle's discovery is about to make me very rich, exactly what he tried to prevent." "That's why you killed him," Adam said, his voice tight with anger. "Because he refused to let you patent the monk's stellata compounds. He was going to publish his findings openly." Blake confirmed, decades of potential pharmaceutical profits thrown away for the common good. "I offered him a partnership, a share in the profits. He declined." As Blake's attention was focused on Adam, Miss Marple noticed Lucia slowly moving to position herself behind the assistant curator. The Italian botanist caught Miss Marple's eye with a slight nod. "You arranged the partnership with Meridian Pharmaceuticals before Professor Harrington even died," Miss Marple said deliberately, drawing Blake's attention back to her. "That's why your photograph was on their boardroom wall advisory capacity." Only Blake said with a thin smile. "Though they've promised me a full directorship once I deliver the monk's hood stellata specimens and research what might have happened next remained unknown." For at that moment Inspector Slack's authoritative voice cut through the tension. "That's quite enough. Mr. Blake, put that vial down carefully. And put your hands where I can see them." The inspector appeared at the entrance to the secluded corner, flanked by two constables. Blake, seeing himself surrounded, made a desperate move toward Dr. Forsyte with the vial, but Lucia Moretti acted swiftly, knocking it from his hand with a botanical collecting pole. The vial shattered harmlessly on the stone ground as the constables took a protesting Blake into custody. Inspector Slack explained that they had been alerted by Mrs. Pritchard, who had overheard Blake making a suspicious telephone call that morning, and had noted his hasty departure from the garden's most fortunate timing. Inspector Miss Marple said with genuine relief, "Though I must say Mr. Blake's confession was most illuminating." Later, as they walked back toward the village, Dr. Forsyte, carefully carrying the legitimately collected specimens, Miss Marple reflected on the case. "There's still something that doesn't quite fit," she said thoughtfully. "If Blake killed Professor Harrington because he refused to patent the discovery, why did he then begin substituting specimens in the collection? And who attacked you in the greenhouse?" "Perhaps Blake was working with someone else," Dr. Forsyte suggested. Perhaps Miss Marple agreed, though her tone suggested she was not entirely convinced. "I wonder if we might examine Professor Harrington's personal effects again. There may be something we've overlooked back at Thornfield Gardens." The atmosphere was tense but relieved following Blake's arrest. Mrs. Pritchard greeted them with evident concern. "Thank goodness you're both safe," the elderly secretary said. "When I heard Mr. Blake talking about following you to the ruins, I feared the worst." "Your alerting Inspector Slack was most timely," Miss Marple assured her. "Mrs. Pritchard, might we trouble you for the key to Professor Harrington's cabinet? I believe there may be additional notes relevant to the investigation." Of course, the secretary agreed, though Miss Marple noticed a slight hesitation. Before she produced the key, "The police have already examined it, but you're welcome to look." As Dr. Forsyte busied herself with properly storing the precious specimens, Miss Marple observed Mrs. Pritchard's movements with increasing interest. The elderly woman seemed unusually tense, her gaze repeatedly darting toward the research greenhouse. Making a sudden decision, Miss Marple excused herself, saying she needed to collect her handbag from the curator's office. Instead, she made her way quietly to the research greenhouse. Through the glass, she saw Mrs. Pritchard moving with surprising speed and purpose toward the locked cabinet, bearing Professor Harrington's name, a small key already in her hand. Miss Marple watched as the secretary removed something from the cabinet, a journal and a small box that appeared to contain plant specimens. The elderly woman's expression was not that of someone engaged in wrongdoing, but rather reflected a strange determination, as if completing a necessary task in that moment. Miss Marple realized that while Geoffrey Blake might indeed have killed Thomas Jenkins, he might not have been responsible for Professor Harrington's death. After all, the roots of this mystery reached deeper than she had imagined, extending into the past and connecting generations of secrets. And Mrs. Pritchard, the seemingly loyal secretary who had served at Thornfield Gardens for decades, clearly knew more than she had revealed. Much more. Chapter 6: Deadly Harvest. The main greenhouse of Thornfield Gardens was bathed in golden afternoon light, as Miss Marple arranged the final details for what she privately thought of as the denouement. At her request, Inspector Slack had agreed to this unusual gathering, though his agreement had come with considerable reluctance and the condition that he and a constable be present throughout. "I still don't see why this theatrical approach is necessary, Miss Marple," he grumbled as they waited for the others to arrive. "We have Blake's confession regarding Jenkins's murder, but not regarding Professor Harrington," Miss Marple pointed out mildly, "and there are still several loose ends that require explanation." The inspector harumphed but offered no further objection. Soon the greenhouse doors opened to admit Dr. Forsyte, followed shortly by Adam Harrington and Lucia Moretti, who entered together. Last to arrive was Mrs. Pritchard, who appeared somewhat flustered, her usually impeccable grey hair slightly disheveled. "Thank you all for coming," Miss Marple began once everyone was seated among the exotic foliage. "Inspector Slack has kindly allowed me to share some observations that may help complete our understanding of recent events." She looked around at the assembled faces, noting the varying expressions of curiosity, tension, and in one case carefully controlled apprehension. "This mystery," she continued, "centers not just on murder, but on a botanical discovery of immense scientific and commercial value. Professor Harrington had indeed made a remarkable discovery, not just rediscovering an extinct plant, but proving that the medieval monks of St. Mary Mead had developed advanced hybridization techniques centuries ahead of their time." Dr. Forsyte nodded in confirmation. "The monk's hood stellata specimens we found show clear evidence of deliberate cultivation and selective breeding. It's botanically revolutionary, but there's more to the story," Miss Marple continued. "During his research in South America, Professor Harrington found similar plants used by indigenous healers and realized the connection to the medieval European specimens. His discovery of a lifetime was proving that botanical knowledge had been exchanged between the continents long before Columbus, a finding that would rewrite scientific history. My uncle was ecstatic when he confirmed the genetic connection," Adam added. "He'd spent years developing the hypothesis, but the final proof came only in those last months. The professor had been secretly cultivating these hybrids," Miss Marple explained, "combining the South American and St. Mary Mead specimens to recreate the full medicinal potential described in medieval texts. Mr. Blake, discovering this research and recognizing its pharmaceutical value, attempted to steal the work for himself, partnering with Meridian Pharmaceuticals to patent the compounds. That's why he killed Thomas Jenkins," Lucia said softly. "Because Jenkins discovered him removing plants from the ruins." "Yes," Miss Marple agreed. "But Mr. Blake was not responsible for Professor Harrington's death." A charged silence followed this statement. Inspector Slack straightened in his chair, his expression alert. "If not Blake, then who?" he demanded. Miss Marple turned her gentle gaze to Mrs. Pritchard, who sat very still, her hands folded tightly in her lap. "That crime," Miss Marple said quietly, "was committed by Mrs. Pritchard, whose family had been the traditional keepers of the monastery garden's secrets for generations." Mrs. Pritchard did not deny the accusation. She raised her chin slightly, her eyes clear and unrepentant. "How did you know?" she asked simply. "Several small things," Miss Marple replied. "Your reaction when Blake was arrested. Relief, yes, but not the complete relief of someone who believes all danger has passed. Then there was your knowledge of the gardens, far more extensive than would be expected even from long service, but most tellingly I observed you removing items from Professor Harrington's locked cabinet yesterday. A journal and plant specimens that the police hadn't found. The journal contained the true history," Mrs. Pritchard said softly. "A history that Professor Harrington had pieced together, and that should have remained private. Would you share that history with us now?" Miss Marple suggested gently. Mrs. Pritchard looked around at the assembled faces, then nodded slowly. My family has served as guardians of the monkshood stellata since the dissolution of the monasteries under Henry VIII. She began, her voice taking on a formal quality as if reciting a long memorized text when the monks were driven out. Brother Ambrose entrusted the secret of the healing plants to my ancestor, who had worked in the monastery gardens for nearly 500 years. The knowledge was passed down through the women of my family, the location of the plants, the proper way to harvest them, the preparation of remedies. The Jenkins family were also part of this tradition, weren't they? Miss Marple asked. Yes, Mrs. Pritchard acknowledged. Thomas's grandmother was my aunt. Our families intermarried over centuries, keeping the knowledge close. We used the plants sparingly, only for those in dire need, following Brother Ambrose's instruction that the cure for all ills was not to be exploited for profit or fame. And then Professor Harrington discovered your secret, Dr. Forsyth said with dawning comprehension. He was brilliant. Mrs. Pritchard admitted he noticed patterns in local medicinal folklore, traced references in old manuscripts. When he found the plants at the ruins, he immediately recognized their significance. At first I tried to mislead him, but he was too knowledgeable to be deceived for long. So you decided to silence him permanently? Inspector Slack stated flatly. Mrs. Pritchard met his gaze unflinchingly. I did what generations of my family have done, protected the secret. These plants were meant to heal, not to make pharmaceutical companies wealthy. When Professor Harrington told me he intended to publish his findings and share the discovery with Meridian, I knew I had to act. You used a toxin derived from the plants themselves. Miss Marple said, something that would mimic the symptoms of his existing heart condition, a tincture passed down through generations. Mrs. Pritchard confirmed, quick, painless and undetectable. I added it to his tea that evening. And afterward you began systematically removing evidence of his research. Dr. Forsyth added, substituting specimens, removing notes. I tried. The elderly woman sighed. But he had been thorough in his documentation when you were appointed as his successor, and began to follow the same trail. I grew concerned. The attack in the greenhouse was meant to frighten you away from the investigation, not to cause serious harm. You sedated me, Doctor Before said, more in wonder than accusation, and placed the extinct specimen in your hand as a warning. Mrs. Pritchard nodded. I never intended for Jenkins to be harmed when Blake killed him. I realized how far out of control the situation had become as Inspector Slack moved to formally arrest Mrs. Pritchard. She remained composed, even dignified. I was protecting a sacred trust, she said firmly. These plants and their healing properties were preserved for centuries for the common good, not for corporate profits. The journal, Miss Marple said gently. May we see it now? Mrs. Pritchard indicated her handbag, from which Inspector Slack carefully removed an ancient leather-bound volume. Inside, in faded ink, was a detailed account beginning with Brother Ambrose's original covenant with the Pritchard family, continuing through generations of caretakers who had maintained the plants and used their properties to heal the sick of St. Mary Me and surrounding. Professor Harrington had added his own observations, documenting both the botanical significance and the historical importance of the pact to preserve the plants for humanitarian, rather than commercial purposes. As Mrs. Pritchard was led away, Dr. Forsyth turned to Miss Marple and Adam Harrington with sudden determination. There must be a way to honor both scientific progress and traditional wisdom, she said thoughtfully. What if the monkshood stellata and its derivatives were studied at Thornfield Gardens, with any medical applications developed on a humanitarian basis, ensuring the plants fulfilled their original purpose as a cure for all ills, accessible to everyone? Adam said, warming to the idea. My uncle would have approved of that approach. I believe he would. Miss Marple agreed. And perhaps Mrs. Pritchard's family knowledge could still contribute to that effort, even if in a different way than her ancestors might have envisioned. The following week, as Miss Marple tended her garden, in the soft spring sunshine, she reflected on the resolution of the case. Mrs. Pritchard had been charged, but given her age and the unusual circumstances, there was talk of leniency. Geoffrey Blake faced more serious consequences for Jenkins' murder and his attempted attack at the ruins. Dr. Forsyth had proposed a research foundation dedicated to studying historical plant remedies for modern medical applications, with profits directed to making treatments accessible in developing countries. Adam Harrington and Lucia Moretti had agreed to join the project, bringing their respective expertise in botany-ethnoparmacology. As for the monkshood stellata itself, specimens had been carefully transplanted to a secure location within Thornfield Gardens. While leaving the original colony at the monastery ruins undisturbed, a living link to centuries of botanical history, Miss Marple's contemplations were interrupted by the arrival of her nephew Raymond, who had come to hear firsthand about her latest adventure in detection. "It's really quite extraordinary, Aunt Jane," he said after she had related the tale. "How did you ever suspect Mrs. Pritchard? She seemed the very model of a proper secretary." "Well, dear," Miss Marple replied, carefully planting a small cutting she had taken from the monastery ruins beside her prized roses, "in my experience the most dedicated guardians of tradition are often those who appear most conventional. Mrs. Pritchard reminded me rather of old Mrs. Bessington in the village, who maintains that her family's Christmas pudding recipe is a closely guarded secret worth protecting at all costs." Raymond laughed. "Hardly the same thing as murder, Aunt Jane." "No indeed," she agreed mildly. "But the principle is similar. The fierce protection of something passed down through generations. Human nature doesn't change, you know, whether it's concerning Christmas puddings or medieval plants." As Raymond departed, Miss Marple turned back to her gardening, gently patting the soil around the new cutting. Like the monks of old, she would tend this small piece of living history, continuing a tradition of cultivation and care that spanned centuries. The oldest mysteries, she reflected, often lie hidden in plain sight, and human nature, with its capacity for both destruction and noble purpose, remains as complex and varied as the plant kingdom itself. Some secrets were worth preserving, others worth revealing, and the wisdom lay in knowing the difference. Miss Marple smiled as a light breeze carried the scent of her roses across the garden. This particular mystery had been solved, but the greater mysteries of nature and human behavior would continue to unfold season after season in the rich soil of St. Mary Me.